here. Um, so today
Mike
we're
says you
talking.
are on Facebook.
We are?
That's what Mike said.
Okay, thank you. So so now as we look to the post Camp David situation into the 80s, we're going to talk about another war, unfortunately, two more wars really, including the one that we're in the midst of right now, because right now we are in the midst of a war. But so we're going to talk about two wars. The one war we're going to talk about right now starts not long after the Camp David Accords, because peace with Egypt comes about in the late 70s. As that's implemented, Israel withdraws from the Sinai. And not long after that, in 1982, the war begins in Lebanon. And you can see here, this is this chart that I have that is downloadable up on our website where our materials are. This list of the prime ministers of Israel shows us that during this period, this red period, it's Menachem Begin, the prime minister from Likud, from the right wing, that signs the Camp David Accords. He's followed by his successor is Yitzhak Shamir, who's his lieutenant, if you will. He's his assistant. Also very far right, was part of the Irgun, was part of the very far right group of Israelis during the pre-war before 1948. The Irgun was the far right um, in Israel's pre-state Israel. So Yitzhak Shamir was part of that group as well. And so during this next period, after Begin resigned and stepped down, really because of his age and because of his inability to, he really felt he was already in his 70s by then. He really felt that he was not at his best, and so he stepped aside. And what happened was that Israel went through a period of time in the 80s where uh, the economy was dealing with some real challenges in the 80s in Israel. Economically, Israel had massive inflation. They were trying to deal with the fact that they had absorbed so many people over the last 30 years, and they really had created a socialist country, but they really needed to kind of find a way to stabilize their economy and transition it to some extent from a socialist nation, which was almost necessary in order to do the absorption, to handle the aliyah from all of these Jews. I mean, as we said, especially during the 50s and 60s, Jews from Iraq, from Syria, from Yemen, from Egypt, from Algeria, from Morocco, those Mizrahi Jews, they needed a home, right? They were thrown out of their countries, right? These were Arab communities that threw the Jews out of their countries. Not so much Morocco, because Morocco was much more tolerant of the Jewish community and still has a Jewish community, but many of the Jews in Morocco did not feel safe, and they made Aliyah, or they came to Canada, or they came to France. The reality was is that Israel had an enormous economic burden in creating the safety net to allow people to be absorbed. And it was a huge part of the population. You're talking about the population doubling and then doubling again. So it was very difficult. And during that time, during the 80s, as Begin and then transitions into Shamir, we have during the 80s the Lebanon War, and it technically starts during Menachem Begin's last year before he leaves. And the war in Lebanon was called Shalom LaGalil, and I'll show you a map of how it started. It started in 1982, and what precipitated it was the attempted assassination of Israel's ambassador in London, Shlomo Argov, is shot very seriously wounded, but doesn't die. He actually spends the next 20 years of his life in agony and essentially in rehabilitation for the next 20 years. He lives for 20 more years, and he feels terrible that his his attempted assassination to some extent is the last straw for Israel. Israel had dealt with frequent cross-border attacks into Israel from Lebanon. This is Lebanon here. And The PLO is based here in Lebanon. If you look at this map, all of these yellow triangles are refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps. So you can see them here, you can see them here, you can see them all the way up here. You can still see Palestinian refugee camps that are in Lebanon. So the Lebanese government was already in the midst of a they were fighting a civil war. It was a civil war that was not one side. It wasn't two sides fighting, one side fighting another side. It was many sides fighting an internal war. And in that vacuum, the PLO was essentially allowed to run their operations out of Lebanon. And so after some members of the Palestinian terror groups attempted the assassination of Argov in London, Israel said, we can't let the PLO continue to do this. And this is the PLO being run by Yasser Arafat. The headquarters are there in Lebanon, and Israel says enough is enough. And so Israel invades Lebanon in June of 1982. So this is roughly 3 or 4 years after the Camp David Accords were initiated and signed. Again, the withdrawal from Sinai is gradual, but the peace with Egypt is a done deal. And Israel, to some extent, says, look, we have to create a situation so that the PLO cannot infiltrate from the north here. And again, this is not Hezbollah, this is PLO. They're infiltrating, and we have to clear out this border. And so Israel eventually, well, let me explain this. The war, within the first few days of the war, the Israeli army, under the leadership of the chief of staff of the army, who's Ariel Sharon, they are able to not only basically overrun the PLO in southern Lebanon, they go up all the way here to Beirut. And you can see a lot of the PLO camps are in Beirut. They're not just down here closer to the border, right? They're all the way up here. And this is about 30 miles, 40 miles from the border. This area right here is about 15 miles, and it's about another 20, 30 miles up to Beirut, but it's not far. I mean, this is northern Israel, right? This is the area we go to Rosh HaNikra when we go to the grottos. The grottos are right here. You go from here to there, and there used to be a train that ran here along this beautiful coastline up through the 1940s. You took a train, and it took an hour to get from Beirut to the border of Israel. That's it. Took an hour. And that was in the 1940s. Hour and a half, with a couple stops, with a stop in Sidon and a stop in Tyre. That's how close it is. And so Israel is able to very quickly go all the way up into this area. Now, what happens is that Israel is a victim to some extent of its own success, because Israel is very quickly able to drive the PLO out. It literally takes only a couple of months. The PLO evacuates from Beirut in August. Remember, they invade in June. This is the first time that Israel has occupied another country. Why is this important? Because unfortunately, right now, as we speak, Israel is in these same areas. So I want you to understand that this history from 43 years ago is still being played out right now and is vitally important for you to understand. Because at the time that this happens, Lebanon still has a sizable enough Christian community that there is the hope that when Israel knocks the PLO out of Lebanon, the Southern Lebanese Army, which is the Christian militia, okay, because every group has their own army. The Druze have their own army. The Shiites have their own army, which obviously ends up becoming Hezbollah. And the Christians have their own armies. And it's not one army, by the way. The Christians have two or three militias. Some of them are more, some of them are more favorable inclined to Israel, for example. Other ones are not. these are not one group. There are different factions within the ethnic groups. And remember, Lebanon as a country was protected and formed by the French to protect the Christians and to basically create a Christian enclave in the Middle East. And it's already by the 80s really, well, by the 70s it's falling apart, but in the 80s it's just a complete disaster. And so when Israel knocks out the Palestinians, they're hoping that the Christian Lebanese will be able to hold the country, especially this border. So you can see that this area here that's shaded is the southern Lebanese army, which is the Christian militia, the SLA. They are going to hold this position along the Israeli border with Israel's help. So with coordinated Israeli guidance and with Israeli soldiers, but limited amount of soldiers, the hope is that the border with Israel will be protected by Christian Lebanese. The fact that some of you don't know this is a pretty clear indicator that it didn't work. The Christian Lebanese were not strong enough to hold that territory. Even with Israeli help, they were not able to do it. The Christian Lebanese, for various reasons, including the internal fighting that went on within their own community, also during this period of time perpetrated one of the worst human rights disasters of the 80s. And that's the massacre right here at the Palestinian camps called Sabra and Shatila. And
Nope. Oh, Tony.
some of you remember those stories, right? Some of you remember what happened at Sabra and Shatila during this period because the Christian Lebanese who are in charge of the area went into Sabra and Shatila and massacred the Palestinians who were there. And Israel was held responsible to some extent because Israel was militarily in control of most of that area at the time. And so people thought that Sharon, and there was an investigation that Israel conducted to see who was responsible for this barbaric murder. Well, again, we can leave it to how history will decide this, but the Christian Lebanese were not able to maintain their hold really on anything because all of this area that Israel clears out all the way up here to we call the Litani River zone. This blue is the river called the Litani River that Israel said that, look, we got to keep the PLO and we got to keep terrorists out of this area. Well, that has been an ongoing issue because when the PLO left, it was not filled by the Christians. It was filled by Shiite Muslims that were armed by Iran, and we call those people, they call themselves Hezbollah. There's your Hezbollah. That's how Hezbollah started. It started as the Iranian-backed Shiite Muslim militia that took over Lebanon. And up until recently, my friends, they ran Lebanon. They were the strongest military force in Lebanon, stronger than the Lebanese owned government military. The Lebanese army, which does exist, was nowhere near as powerful as Hezbollah. During the last year and a half, through a lot of back channel negotiations, a lot of support from countries like France and England that are patrons of the Christian community and the hope that Lebanon can be a multi-religious, multi-ethnic state. They have done their best to stabilize and to build up the Lebanese army as a counterbalance to Hezbollah, because during the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, Israel has decimated Hezbollah leadership and continue to do so right now. We'll get to that when we get to today. But right now, this area that Israel is unfortunately in again, they are there from 1982 till 2000. Israel is in Lebanon for nearly 20 years, friends. And Israeli soldiers are killed there every year for 18 years. There are Israeli soldiers that are killed while they're trying to prevent terrorists from attacking Israel. And eventually, the Israeli government in charge in 2000, we'll get to it, decides the soldiers will no longer be there. We'll have to deal with it. We'll have to deal with it behind the lines. And they negotiate the removal of Israeli forces with the understanding that, of course, that Hezbollah will not maintain rocket sites in that area, which of course they immediately did. They violated the agreement immediately. The minute the Israelis had left, they went in and put in their military installations, their bases of operations, their tunnels. Immediately, those areas became they violated the agreement with Israel, and Israel knew it. I mean, Israel wasn't surprised, but nobody did anything about it. The United Nations has a force here called UNIFIL. UNIFIL, United Nations Force for Lebanon, was supposed to protect Israel's border. They've done nothing. On the contrary, they've actually given cover to Hezbollah because Hezbollah will use UNIFIL positions for their own terror supplies. So Israel, after October 7th, decides, of course, that they're not going to put up with this anymore. And we'll get to that, but not yet. This is what happened in Lebanon. And again, many Israeli soldiers died over that 18 years in this kind of ongoing occupation. And this is an occupation. This is an occupation that Israel had of Lebanon, and they called it an occupation. They didn't use other words. They said Israel's occupying southern Lebanon. Here's an interesting picture, my friends. This is my dad in Lebanon in 1983. And at the time, my dad was taking Americans, especially celebrities, into Lebanon to visit with soldiers and to meet with the Southern Lebanese Christians to try to get their support. This is my dad with Tom Hayden, who was famous from being one of the Chicago Seven, but he's much more famous because he's here with his wife. You see who that is, right? Everybody? Yeah.
Boo.
That's Jane Fonda. So Jane Fonda, and this is 10 years after Hanoi Jane, is there with Israeli soldiers supporting and giving comfort and giving publicity for the work that Israel's doing to try to clear out the terrorist proxies and and really um, I'm showing you this because this was 40 years ago, friends. And think about how the world has changed. I mean,
That's
this is Tom Hayden. This is Tom Hayden, one of the Yippies, one of the original Yippies. How far we've come that the
I don't
leaders of
see what you're
the
talking about.
most liberal voices in America at the time not only supported Israel, but supported Israel's occupation of Lebanon.
I don't see what you're posting.
You don't see it?
No,
You're on the wrong screen then, Philip.
maybe I am.
So you got to go to where the not you got to go where not where the our faces are.
Where the people are. Yeah, I gotta
Oh, I
swipe
see.
the other
Okay,
way.
I got it.
Don't
I
don't
got it.
worry, don't worry, Philip. You're not missing much.
Okay, okay.
I got it.
Listen,
I have a quick question. We were
yes.
there in 1982. I'm losing my geography. When we visited the Good Fence,
Yep.
was
That's
that
in Metula. That's in Metula. Yeah, you
okay?
did.
So it was right
So,
there.
so what did you do when you went to the Good Fence? What did you see there? Do you remember?
I just remember seeing, you could see like the military on the other side.
Yep.
You could see them in the hills. There was, of course, a tourist thing. And there were all the signs about turn your swords into plowshares and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that little window there, Esther, was a time when Israel and Lebanon had a little border that you could cross at Metula, at the Good Fence in northern Israel. You could cross over into Lebanon, and Israelis weren't really going into they weren't like doing tourist stuff in Lebanon. There was a war going on, but
Hey, Rabbi.
Lebanese people were going back and forth. Druze citizens were going back and forth. And you know what else was happening? Lebanese citizens that needed to be treated in Israeli hospitals would come through the Good Fence and be able to go and be treated in Haifa and the Israeli hospitals in the north. Yes, John.
Just so
Yeah.
everybody knows, just that the rabbi is not taking rabbinical license here. If you if you AI or Google Jane Fonda in Lebanon with Phil Blazer, you'll have a whole description of the whole thing. It's pretty awesome. No rabbinical license here.
It's a wild thing. And I want to tell you, John, again, it's how our mind works in time. That was 10 years after her standing on a aircraft anti-aircraft artillery anti-aircraft unit in Vietnam. And 10 years later, she's walking through Lebanon with I don't even believe that it's a real photo. It's a real photo. I remember when they were on the trip. So I want to tell you that that's a real thing. And if I ever see Jane Fonda, I'll ask her. I mean, how do you rectify your anti-Israel position? And again, she's couched some of her comments in the fact that she knows her history. She knows what she stood for, and she knows where her heart was. Because one of the things that my dad did with her was my dad had her speak out against Vanessa Redgrave when Vanessa Redgrave was the outlier, right? When Vanessa Redgrave was the only actress in the world that would stand and shout for the Palestinians, in the 1980s, Vanessa Redgrave was the only person. And Jane Fonda would say she's wrong. And they worked together, they were in movies together, and he got her a few times to have Jane Fonda come out and come to events and say, Jane would say, look, Vanessa Redgrave is on the wrong side of this. She's supporting terrorists. So it was a very to say it was a very different time is stupid. So I'm not going to be stupid. It's hard to believe that this is the same
Thank you.
people and that this is the same discussion that we should be having today, which is why is Israel again is now the villain in a situation where we're going to get to it. Let me get to it. All right. So during the 80s, this is going on. And while it's happening, as I said, Israel is a victim of its own success because they drive the PLO out of Lebanon to Syria, to Tunisia. And in those places, something else is happening in the late 80s, and that is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Palestinians realize that they need to do something to reposition themselves with the West. And that's where you start to have the PLO moderate their statements to say, now we don't we don't need to have all of Israel. We need to have the areas that Israel stole in 1948. Now, of course, again, where they then said, well, we'll go to the 67 border. Well, the PLO was started in 1964, 3 years before Israel had ever stepped foot in the West Bank. And so we knew that it was a lie. I mean, most people knew, but they were, you could say that at the best that they were being hopeful that the PLO was starting to moderate, but they were moderating because they were thrown out of a very secure base on the border with Israel. It's very hard for Yasser Arafat to run missions and to have know exactly what's happening with the terrorists that are they're still terrorists, by the way, in PLO terrorists that are still working out of Syria, and they're still working out of places in Lebanon. But it's all gone to hell for him. It really has. I mean, Israel, you don't understand. Ariel Sharon was completely successful, over successful in the military campaign. And again, Israel is a victim of that success because once the PLO had lost their foothold, they started to figure out how do we have to, how can we be relevant? And again, once they lost their Soviet sponsors, they had no choice. So they start to make there's the first peace overtures. There's what we call the Madrid Peace Conference. There will eventually be what we call the Oslo Accords in the early 90s. But these first attempts the PLO makes is to try to negotiate with the government of Israel. And the government of Israel, still dealing with some economic challenges, creates its first national unity government where both Likud and Labor, the left and the right, are now, or the right and the left for that matter, if we say Likud and Labor, where they share the government and they rotate prime ministers. So that Yitzhak Shamir, who's the Likud prime minister, then turns over power to Shimon Peres, who will then turn back power to Yitzhak Shamir. And so during that period from 1983 to 1992, you have two prime ministers, both on different sides of the aisle or the spectrum, who are essentially ruling for about 10 years. And during that
Also,
time, yes, sorry,
also
John.
don't forget not so much specific to Israel, but the Marine barracks and the French barracks were bombed in '83.
Yeah,
So
you're right. It's an important thing to talk about in the backdrop of Lebanon to remember the
everything
Marines.
was happening. Yep.
The
A lot of
Marine,
stuff was happening.
the Marines were murdered there, and yeah, that was part of the hellscape. Yeah, I didn't go through all the
I know.
Did,
the
did
head of the
you,
CIA, who was the CIA division there, who was taken hostage and murdered. The people who were caught in the midst of Lebanon, American soldiers and Americans. Steve Kerr's father, who was the university uh, president at American University in Lebanon, who was taken hostage and also murdered. The people who died in Lebanon during that period of time, with the hope that Lebanon would be able to find its footing either through now the PLO being gone or some kind of miracle. They were sadly mistaken because it's now 2026 and Lebanon has not had too many years of peace. But so thanks, John, for reminding us of the murder of Americans there, murdered by Hezbollah. Hezbollah armed and financed by Iran. That was a direct example of the Ayatollahs being responsible for the direct destruction of American life and yeah, during this period, during the 80s to 90s, we also have what's called the First Intifada. And the First Intifada was a popular uprising led by Palestinians who were not members of the PLO to start with. These were average, ordinary Palestinians who in 1987 decided that we have to do something to get rid of Israeli occupation, and we can't rely on the PLO anymore. And so the PLO was really caught off guard and eventually tried to take control of it. But what they realized, almost more than losing the Soviet Union, losing their bases in Lebanon, they lost control of the Palestinian mob. The Palestinians were no longer really from 87 wanting to hear from Yasser Arafat or wanting to hear from their Palestinian leaders who they by this point, by the way, this is 1987. This is 40 years later. They'd lost their chance of having a home 40 years before when they refused to have a homeland in the area that the UN gave to them. 40 years later, they're saying, we're done with this leadership. They've done nothing for us. They don't speak for us. And so the Israelis were obviously caught off guard as well. This first intifada, I want to make clear, this was a popular uprising and it began to shift popular views against Israel even in this period of time. And I remember it because I was in college at the time and I saw it starting then. I saw people starting to call Israel, they didn't use the word genocide, but they called Israel occupiers. They called Israel, a fascist state, an apartheid state. They were already starting to use those words in 87. And this was the first intifada. I want to make it clear, it's much different than the second intifada, which was completely directed by the Palestinian leadership, by the PLO, and was much, much more violent. The first intifada really started with rock throwing, with attacks that were, for the most part, not. I want to make it clear there were definitely Israelis who died, but nothing like what happened during the second intifada, which we'll get to. But this really forces the PLO to come to the table with Israel and to sign what's called the Oslo Accords, which is the Israeli and PLO accords, which were the basis for a two-state 3. They were brokered by, as you know, the president at the time, right, Bill Clinton. And the hope in the Oslo Accords is that there is going to be a two-state solution. Now, the prime minister of Israel at the time is Yitzhak Rabin. We've gone back to Yitzhak Rabin, who 20 years before, right after Golda Meir resigned, he took over, and then he got into trouble because his wife had a bank account in America. The worst thing you could do, right? He is the prime minister, and he's a labor leader. He's on the left, but he's considered very strong on Israeli defense. He had been the head of the military. He was very well respected, and he was not considered a softie by any stretch of the imagination. So when he signed the peace treaty, people thought this was this was this was for real. This was going to be implemented because Yitzhak Rabin would not go into an accord if we couldn't protect Israelis. And so that's followed by a treaty also with Jordan, which now makes Israel have peaceful borders on its south and on its east. The two largest borders that it has land-wise, right, are now safe and secure. Israel can now have free trade, have free movement between those countries. Israeli tourists can go to the pyramids starting in the late 70s. Israelis can now go to Petra and all the things in Lebanon starting in the 1990s. Now, this hope for peace, of course, becomes something um, for many reasons, and they're not apparent right away, but they will be apparent soon, which is Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated on November 4th, 1995, one of the darkest days in Israel's history. He's assassinated by an Israeli, and most Israelis won't even say his name. They won't mention his name. They don't want to give the murderer credit, which is not what we do in America. You know, everyone knows Lee Harvey Oswald's name. They know his name in Israel, but they don't say it. And if you go to the place, the Shalom Square, the Peace Square, the Rabin Square in Tel Aviv, it says this is where he was assassinated by the assassin, by the killer. It doesn't say his name. So it shows you a little difference in the way Israel treats the villains, if you will. And Shimon Peres takes over, but as you can see, he doesn't take over for long, right? He's in power for less than a year because Israel will have elections. The first time, by the way, that Israel will directly elect a prime minister. Instead of just going through the parliamentary process, they're actually going to do it the American style, voting for a president. They vote for their prime minister. And Shimon Peres loses to Netanyahu. This is the first time that Netanyahu becomes prime minister. He becomes prime minister in 1996. And during this period of time, we have a horrible wave of attacks within Israel, within within uh, uh, I mean, some would say this is an indication that this is not going to be a smooth transition to peace. So again, some of it comes internally, and some of it comes from the external issues. This is not really the second intifada, but it's there's enough attacks. They're not constant like it is during the second intifada, which you can see starts in about 2000. But it's a precursor. It's an indication of what's going to happen because you start to have in 95, you start to see people, terrorists coming on buses and blowing themselves up on a bus or blowing up a cafe. And Israel's answer is to elect Netanyahu and to elect somebody that they think is going to be stronger on security. It is it doesn't go well because Netanyahu at the time kind of won by promising security and safety, and he's not able to deliver it. And so Israel goes the other direction. They elect Ehud Barak. And Ehud Barak is on the labor side, but he's also a very well respected Israeli general. He's well known from several really daring raids into places like Lebanon when he was in the military, when he was serving, and he's respected as a fighter. His government is under the still the last waning years of Bill Clinton has another Camp David. And this is the famous Camp David return summit that Clinton facilitates between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. And does anyone know what happens at that meeting? Does
According
anyone
to
remember what happens?
according
What?
to according to Clinton, uh, Arafat was offered like over 90% of what he wanted.
Yeah, yeah. Ehud Barak assented to virtually everything that the PLO wanted. And according to Bill Clinton, Arafat said no. And he basically, and you can hear Bill Clinton, I heard him say it in 2024, where he was talking about Israel. He said he knew that the people want to have Israel obliterated. They didn't care about how he knew at that moment that that they were not dealing in good faith. You know, the famous postscript to that story is that when Bill Clinton left office, he got a call from Arafat, and Arafat told him, "You're a great man. You're going to be remembered by history." And Clinton famously says that he told him, "I could have been a great man if it wasn't for you."
I've seen Bill Clinton interviewed about this, and he's still very angry and bitter about it, and blames Arafat 100%.
There's no surprise. He just doesn't want, they don't want peace, and that's just the way it is. You know, it's been 50 years like this. So what's the
We're
surprise back
losing.
then?
Yeah. So it, so this was in 2000, right? This is 2000, 2001. And uh, the Israel is thrown into another disastrous period because this is when the second intifada starts. And again, the precipitation for this supposedly is Ariel Sharon visiting the Temple Mount. Um, One could argue again that this is ridiculous, but Arafat really is in a situation where um, he he um, he's exhausted the United States, you know, the goodwill of the United States, and so he encourages and really not just encourages, he funds the Second Intifada. He makes sure that weapons and materials get to Palestinian terrorists who will, over the course of the Second Intifada, as I said, target Israeli civilians and maximize the um, the death of innocent civilians. It is uh, it sends a shockwave through Israel. It is definitely part of what returns, as you can see, Ariel Sharon and Likud, though Ariel Sharon's part of Likud is Ariel Sharon will break off from Likud to create his own party called Kadima, a winning party, party that is well, we'll talk about, but the Al-Aqsa, just the PLO saying we have to lose, we're going to continue, we're going to continue to make life hell for the Israelis, with the hope that, we'll either turn public sentiment against them, we'll make the Israelis want to, I don't know, give up and go somewhere else. I don't know. But during this period of time from 2000 to 2005, almost 800 civilians, Israeli civilians, are killed by Palestinian terrorists over 5 years. I mean, do the math. It's a couple hundred. And I was in Israel during this period of time. We were not taking groups to Israel during this period of time because we couldn't guarantee the safety of people in Israel during this period of time. Interestingly, during this period of time is when, though, Birthright started. Birthright started in 2000 and continued during this. But I groups till about 2006. Why did I feel comfortable taking Jewish groups to Israel in 2006? Because of this, the security barrier, sometimes called the wall. During this period of time, Ariel Sharon, the government during this period, starts to build a security barrier to make sure that terrorists can't go in and out of Israel whenever they want. During this period of time, when Sharon is in power, he breaks from the rest of Likud because he also believes that Israel, as much as they need to protect the West Bank and as much as they need to protect the Jews who live in Israel and to protect the Jews who live in the West Bank, there is no reason why Jews should be in Gaza. And so Ariel Sharon in 2005 evacuates what we call, again, this Gaza disengagement. He forcibly removes Jews from Gaza. We forget that 20 years ago, 21 years ago, there were Jews living in Gaza in 11 communities dotted across Gaza. And Israel took those people out of Gaza and said, we can't have this anymore. We can't run Gaza the way we've been running it. And Sharon calculated that it's best for us to disengage, see what the Palestinians do. And we all know what the Palestinians do. They turned all those areas where the Jews lived into, well, they took everything they could and turned it into weapon. They took the pipes and turned them into rockets. They took whatever electronics they could have and repurposed them into weapons. They literally turned their pruning hooks into spears. They turned their plowshares into swords. And so Israel, again, Ariel Sharon was thinking as a general, he's thinking as a military person, he's thinking, hey, we cut our losses in Gaza, we pull our people out and seal it off. It's their problem. During this period of time, we have a new president of the United States, George W. Bush. And George W. Bush is very well intentioned, but in 2005 and 2006, as he's making his way through his second term, early in his second term, he announces that there's going to be elections in Gaza, that Gaza should have free elections. And we're going to create a democratic homeland for the Palestinians in Gaza. And if that works, maybe we'll have it in the West Bank. Well, we know how that turned out, because the people who won the Gaza election was Hamas. And Israel told Bush, if you hold an election, Hamas will win. PLO won't win. The Palestinian Authority will not win. It will be Hamas. And they did it anyways. Because, again, best intentions, Bush thought that perhaps these people will get their act together, right? They'll they'll have their best interests at heart. And instead, they wanted to kill Jews more than they wanted to have a homeland. And so Gaza in 2005, for the last 20 years, went under the control of Hamas, and ever since has been a terror state. Ariel Sharon ends up having a stroke and going into a coma for many years. And his protege, again, someone who had been on the right, who had been a member of Likud, but is now one of the leaders of the Kadima party, Ehud Olmert, becomes prime minister. Ehud Olmert will go down in Israeli history as the first Israeli prime minister to go to jail because of corruption. But he's the prime minister, and he oversees what we sometimes call the Second Lebanon War and the cast-led operation in Gaza, which was to attack the nascent terror groups. Well, in the case of in the case of Gaza, they're nascent. It's the new and emerging Hamas power, because Hamas, again, when they take over, they also kill or push out any of the PA leaders. Any of the PA leaders that were there in the famous day after election, they threw off several of them off buildings in Gaza, and many of them were able to escape and go into the West Bank and to the PA controlled areas. But Hamas almost immediately begins to start attacking Israel from their positions in Gaza. So that didn't work out well. The the government again tries to deal with terror attacks from southern Lebanon. Israel had removed itself again about 5 or 6 years earlier. By this point, um, Hezbollah has achieved enough success arming itself and taking control of southern Lebanon that they are frequently launching missiles and rockets, really rockets, more from positions in the north of Lebanon, and Israel goes in and attacks positions there, retreats not long after. But this war in Lebanon is kind of a precursor to what Israel's doing now as well, which is try to clear out an area of safety and security for Israelis in the north. Um, but Olmert is, as I said, is eventually goes down in shame, and Netanyahu takes over in 2009 for the first time, and will then be prime minister.
Rabbi,
Yeah, for 12 more years. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if you can, but it's absolutely worth discussing the Annapolis process or the conference that occurred in '07. Well, Omar was just beginning his administration and what was
So,
happening during
so
that
why
period
don't
of
why
time.
don't you why don't you why don't you give your summary of because it's a good thing for you to,
Well,
you served in the military, you understand negotiations, military negotiations, diplomatic negotiations. What do you think about that?
well, in all fairness to everybody, it's not like I've got this stuff memorized or anything, but I saw Annapolis and I said, okay, let me look it up. Well, Rabbi's talking because, I know most of this generically, I know most of this history like all of us do, but I didn't really understand the Annapolis process. And I guess in '07, I really wasn't paying attention to much of it, but you guys can Google it. You can read about it, what was happening. They were trying to, that's when the two-state solution was started to be discussed. And
No, no, this wasn't the beginning of it. This was the Republican-led version of this was the Republican-led version of it, which was, Condoleezza Rice. I mean, people who are, very smart. Again,
oh
not
yeah,
that Bill Clinton is a smart guy too. These were
all the guys at that level. Yeah,
very
yeah,
level-headed people
all their
that tried to bring together Palestinian leadership. The problem, and by the way,
and several Arab states.
Yes, with all fairness, this was now Arafat was gone. Well, I don't know if he
Long
had
gone.
died yet, but Abbas is already in power. So Abbas, Arafat might have died right around then, actually. No, I think he had died a couple years before. Someone can tell me what year Arafat died. But
I have to look it up.
yeah, he was he was not a yeah, he died in 2004, so he had been dead a couple of years. Yeah, so he Abbas is in charge, and it's early in Abbas's career because again, Abbas is still in power, right? 20 years later, 22 years later, he's still in power. And so the hope was that level heads can sit down and negotiate a solution here. And of course, again, this was not literally, I would say, what happens out of this is that the 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 roadmap towards the Abraham Accords is to some extent implemented here because it makes it clear that the United States is going to reward Arab countries who make peace with Israel. And what it comes also through is the fact that the Soviet Union is still in a very weakened position at this point, and no one's there's no remember the United States is pretty much doing anything it wants in Iraq, in pretty much everywhere. It's not a we're not really worried that much about the Russians. So we make it clear to Arab countries, if you come to the table and are you know serious about making peace with Israel, we will reward you. And I think that was I don't want to dismiss it as not important because the reality is it really sets the stage for the Abraham Accords and makes it clear that, and again, the same logic is at stake here. When yesterday, when the president of the United States says to the Arab countries, "Hey, when we sign this deal with Iran, I expect you to join the Abraham Accords." Most people go, "How do you even say something like that? Like, where? How can you be serious about that?" It's because of what happened at Annapolis, what happened really even starting at Oslo and some of these earlier agreements that listen, Arab countries, your job in being, your Arab countries, you need to show your good faith in trying to be neighbors to Israel. And so it's still, I mean, literally it happened yesterday. Everyone's
During
everyone's on Trump's case for saying he expects them to sign the Abraham Accords. I think it's a little far-fetched maybe, but he
wonderful.
should say it. And every American leader should say to the Arab countries, don't think that we're going to let you off the hook like Qatar and some of these other countries. We're going to let you off the hook in Saudi Arabia, that we're going to let you off the hook and let you walk away and say, well, we're not going to sign a peace treaty with Israel until they give the Palestinians a homeland. When you know, and we all know, and because Clinton told it to you 25 years ago, and now in some cases 30 years ago, in 95, that if you really wanted to have peace with Israel, you would have had peace with Israel. You don't want peace. The Palestinians do not want to have peace. And so don't back up. You can't back up and say, well, we want to have peace with Israel before we sign before we have peace with Israel, you have to have peace with the Palestinians. It's not going to fly. And that's why the Abraham Accords, which are, finally again signed, just less than about 7 years ago, when the camp when we go back to Oslo, we go back to Camp David, we go back to all these other agreements, we're now at a place where if you want to have American help, you sign a peace treaty with Israel.
At the time during the process, the big thing was that Hamas was raining down rockets as we're meeting in Annapolis.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the discussions in that room?
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Yeah. Now, Now, what happens over this next period of time, and again, how do we talk about 10 years of time between 2009 and 2020, and I would really say all the way up to 2023. How do we look at this? And again, you can see that Netanyahu is pretty much the prime minister from 2009 until today, with the exception of 1 year of Naftali Bennett, who is also on the right, but is part of a government coalition that was basically created to get rid of. This is another rotation. It should probably show that this was a rotation. It says a coalition, but Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, who's on the center left, that these guys created a party which its only goal was to get rid of Netanyahu. That's what its mandate was, get rid of Netanyahu. But it's basically in power for about a year and a half, 2 years, not even 2 years. So aside from that, from 2009 to 2025, for better or worse, Netanyahu was the prime minister, right? Literally for 15 years, 16 years. So during that period of time, what have we seen? We have seen Israel build a tremendously powerful economy. There's no question. That's not up for discussion. Israel's economy is a powerhouse. And it's exceeded expectations. It's even since October 7th continued to grow at a tremendous pace. There's a lot of reasons for it. I will say again, a couple of them. And again, when we talk about Israel being the startup nation, one of the things that we look at is that Israel, as it's signing peace treaties, and even before the peace treaties are official, Israel already has back channel relations and works on projects with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, with its wealthy neighbors. I want to say wealthy neighbors because obviously some of its neighbors and some of the regional players are not in a good economic situation. Syria has been in a civil war for most of the last 15 years. There's several countries that are nearby Israel that are not economic powerhouses. Jordan is a economic basket case. There are countries in the Arab world that have a crazy amount of wealth, right? And there's other countries that are deeply impoverished and precariously close to having civil war, and in some cases have had civil war. But there
Well,
are other countries that's always underneath. And I'm talking about Jordan. I'm talking about Egypt. I'm talking about all the countries that we saw during the Arab Spring, which happened almost now 13 years ago, how close these countries are from blowing up because of the economic disparity and the lack of hope that the people have. Yes, Philip.
yeah, if you bought the Israel, I did not, but if you bought the Israel ETF iShares back around October 7th, 2023, you would have bought them around $60 a share. That's the ETF. Today, it hit a new 52-week high of $137.60 a share. Okay? So I just want to make that point to the zombie useful idiots.
So Philip, it's a
Wait.
that's the truth.
The
The
symbol is
ticker?
the symbol is E as in Edward, I as in Israel, S as in Sam.
Oh, the iShares. Oh, okay, I see it.
Yeah. Not, I mean, I didn't buy. I should have, but I wasn't even aware it existed.
I didn't even know it existed.
But
Okay.
you have more than doubled your money.
So I want to tell you that during this period of time, Israel's economy growing at a very fast rate, even during the last couple of years of a war, which really surprised lots of people. They thought, how is the government going to be able to manage or even like stabilize the government? They've called up, you know, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. How is the government going to maintain the economy? And Israel's economy has continued because what has happened, again, for a lot of reasons, Israel as the startup nation has become a country where uh, economic opportunity has been encouraged, where Israel has taken its leadership and it's unfortunately by necessity the military the military technology that they developed, they've been able to monetize it, and they have encouraged soldiers to start their own, their own, with government help in some cases, their own tech startups.
But Rabbi,
It-
here's my question.
yeah.
And this is what I don't understand psychologically. Does this just mean, and here's my question, does this just mean that there is a cultural mindset difference between Palestinians, some Arabs, but certainly the Palestinians and Israelis in this sense? If you're a Palestinian and you're living in, excuse my language, the shithole of Gaza, and you know how people are living in Israel, how do you accept your leadership?
What do you want me to tell you? I mean, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
No, no, no,
I,
no, no. It's simple because they feel and it's generational that the land was stolen from them, right? When the Ottomans had it, and then the British have it, and the British didn't have a right to give it away. So it's generational. It just didn't happen like yesterday.
so I'm 18 years old, and my life is going to be this until I die.
I listen.
Really?
It's called brainwashing.
I mean, if that's how you think, then there's nothing to be done.
yeah. Well, I'm not going to argue with that. I can't. I don't know what to say. The last part of what I want to say is during so actually so to talk about what we're going to finish up with is October 7th and where we are today. And I think one of the things I wanted you to see today and over the last couple of weeks is the progression to where we are today. So this is a map of what happened on October 7th. This is the Gaza Strip, and this is the area that on October 7th, Palestinian terrorists and Palestinian civilians and people who just wanted to go out for the day to kill Jews eventually were able to leave Gaza with, you know, trucks and ultralights and motorcycles, and with their bare feet ran over the border and overran Israeli positions and got this far. This red line is how far Palestinian terrorists and Palestinian, I mean, they're civilians. I mean, they were people. I mean, they were not Hamas, always Hamas terrorists. They were 80-year-old people who came over on that day, and this is how far they got. Now, again, they were not able to maintain this incursion. Most of the people, many of the Palestinian, I don't even want to, I don't know what to call them. I don't know. I don't know what to call them. The most of them died. Most of them died. I mean, you call them a terrorist? I mean, they didn't wake up that day going, "Hey, I'm gonna do terror." I'm gonna go kill Jews. Um, Israel was obviously surprised by what happened on October 7th, shocked, still shocked. Israelis are still in shock. One of the reasons why I want to take people to Israel as much as possible right now is for you to understand and you hear about it so much, but I want you to see it with your own eyes. I want you to hold the hands of Israelis. You don't understand how our presence there, the people who are on this call right now, several of them who were with us in Israel, know how much it meant for Israelis to see us there. It's still an issue. There's still very few tourists going there, and you still get a reaction from Israelis that's heartbreaking because they're so appreciative of us being there. But I want you to see with your own eyes. It's difficult. It's because the history is still unfolding. There's still combat operations going on right now. But understand that as much as this was a surprise, this wasn't a surprise to some people because they knew how much hatred there was. This isn't just a war. This isn't just, as John said, this cultural, this is a historical story. The people who are here that Israel is now is very aware because the video is there, the photographs are there. These are people who don't just want to kill them, they want to murder them viciously, violently, in the most graphic and horrific ways possible. And I want to show you a picture because I'm not going to show you a picture of what happened on October 7th. I don't want to show you a picture of what happened on October 7th. This picture is from the year 2000, friends. This was the second intifada. And I want to tie this together for you because this was one of the darkest days of the Second Intifada, right at the beginning, where two Israeli soldiers got on the wrong road and wound up in Ramallah, in the Palestinian Authority, not in Hamas land, not in Gaza, not in. They went to the headquarter city of where the Palestinian Authority is, and these two unfortunate Israeli soldiers just got lost. They wound up they were taken to a room while the PA tried to figure out what to do with them, how to get them back to Israel. But before they could, average, ordinary Palestinians in Ramallah broke in to the building, overran the Palestinian Authority soldiers who were there to protect them, and took them and murdered them in the most horrific, horrific ways that I don't want to talk about right now. And what you're seeing right now is the hands of one of those young people who was responsible for this, holding his hands up with the blood of the Israeli soldiers on his hands in celebration. This is in the year 2000. This is 23 years before October 7th, before what we saw all over the place.
And do you want to let us know what happened to him? Because I know.
Well, why don't you tell us, Philip, what happened to Yahya? Yeah, why don't you tell us what happened to him?
The Israelis went out and killed him.
Yeah, yeah. Because Israel felt that they had to bring justice to the to understand that that didn't happen in Gaza. That happened that happened in the area that the Palestinians were supposed to still. That's the capital of the West Bank, if you will. That's the capital of the PA. That's the capital of the moderate Palestinians. That's the capital of the what would be the Palestinian homeland. That's what happens when a Jew makes the wrong turn on a road. So that's not October 7th, folks.
Regarding something that a question that Phil
Always
posed,
there.
regarding a question that Phil posed earlier when we were in Israel with you and we went to Jordan. We went to Petra. I just
Yeah.
couldn't walk anymore and found a bench right viewing the famous treasury at Petra. And the next thing I know, I am sitting amongst a number of uniformed Jordanian military and one policeman because his uniform was dramatically different. And I started up a conversation, being bashful as I am, with one of these fellas, and he asked me where I was from the United States. Yes. What did I do for a living? I told him I was an engineer. He said, "What kind of an engineer?" He told me he was studying civil engineering and he had 2 more years to go. And then, and this is a uniformed soldier, said to me, "I don't know why I'm wasting my time. There are no jobs. There's no work here for an engineer. This is such a corrupt government." And he said that not only did I hear him clearly, and that's almost as much of an exact quote as I can tell you, but the other soldiers near us heard him as well. I think only two of them maybe spoke English, two others spoke English, but that's what that person in Jordan felt about the Jordanian government. He knew he was in a hole.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
got his picture, by the
Now,
way, which I won't post.
yeah. Now, look, I definitely don't want to end there. I mean, October 7th, again, as we've talked, you know, in a day to have almost in the following months until today, almost 1,000 Israeli soldiers, men and women, have died in places like Gaza and in the north and Lebanon. 1,000 almost have died since. Also, it's almost as many that died on October 7th to make sure this this will never happen again. I honestly believe, I'm going to tell you, like, how can I say this after all this negativity? I honestly believe that the Middle East and Israel in particular is closer to having peace than ever before. I do not know what happens. I have no real guess on what happens with the Palestinians. I don't know what their situation will look like. I have no idea what's created, what it's called, how it exists. I have no idea what a Palestinian authority will be on over the Gaza. I have no idea. I also know that there should be no place in the world, including in the Middle East, where Jews cannot live and cannot be in a place. Right now, the only places in that area where Jews, I mean, if you're a Jew, you can live in Egypt if you want. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but you cannot be a Jew living in Gaza. You cannot be a Jew living in any part of the West Bank that is like Ramallah. You can't be a Jew there.
What about
So
what about London?
Well, that's a good question, Philip. But I will tell you that when we think about, like, where do we go from here, Israel has created a situation where they have obviously created a military that is really second only to the United States in its ability to pretty much achieve almost anything that it wants. As we saw during this last war, we've seen Israel, as I kind of made the parallels to what happened during 56 with Israel cooperating with Britain and France and coordinating an attack on the Suez. We've seen Israel coordinate attacks with the United States military at a level of cooperation that just that alone is a testament to how far Israel has come as a respected uh, ally of the United States and is it's something to recognize as an achievement for Israel, not an achievement that, we would love for Israel to only have achievements in technology and medicine and computers and everything else. That would be great. But it also has to be recognized that Israel is at a place where it can protect its people. Israel has done more damage to its enemies in the last 2 years than it ever thought possible. If you had asked Israelis on October 6th if they ever thought that Israel would attack Iranian nuclear reactors, if you ever thought that they would say, we'll knock out any leader of Hezbollah, we'll kill all of the leaders that we can within a period of days, and we'll knock out any leader of Hamas that comes up, because Hamas, the newest leader of the military wing, got killed yesterday. So there is not an enemy of Israel anymore that's safe anywhere, including in Gaza, in Hamas land. There is not a terrorist that's safe in right now in Lebanon. And what Israel just showed is that the people who've kept these people in power and have armed them and have allowed them to be responsible for wanton destruction in Iran, that they've been put on notice and they've killed them. The leaders and the people who funded this in the IRGC, in the Khomeini uh, administration, have been killed. Will have they all been killed? Obviously not. But the people who are responsible for this carnage and people who everyone thought were untouchable, whether they were in Iran, whether they were in Qatar, whether they were in any part of the world, Israel has put them on notice. You're not safe. If you take Jewish lives, you will be punished. And that is something that we have to recognize. And we have to recognize that, again, should never have to happen. But if it does happen, there's going to be a consequence for it. And what that does is it sends to our enemies the message that if you don't want to have peace with us and you want to have war, there are going to be consequences. I don't know what the future holds, as I said, for the Palestinians. I hope that at some point there's peace in the Middle East, that people don't have to be in fear wherever they live. Wherever they live. If they live in Gaza, if they live in Beit Lahia in a refugee, shouldn't live in a camp anymore. You shouldn't be in a refugee camp. There should be no places called refugee camps for people who've been refugees for 78 years. You're not a refugee anymore. You have to have a home. And if your home is is a building that's called a refugee camp, then we stop calling it a refugee camp. These things, I don't know how they get sorted. I do not know, but I do know that in some ways we've never been closer to peace. I really believe that, and I want you to know that it might not be before the end of this year, but there will be a year where we're going to celebrate the end of the Iranian regime, and the people of Iran will have peace, and then we're going to have a whole nother question, which is does Israel become friendlier with Iran, or does it become friendlier with the Arab nations like Saudi Arabia and UAE? Which ones will be our friends? But I do believe that that's on the horizon, that at some point Israel will not only have peace with its Arab neighbors, but also have peace with its Persian, more distant neighbor. All of this can happen, and all of this in some ways is closer. Is should we have had to go through October 7th in order to do that? That's a ridiculous question. You can't answer that. Can't answer that with any war. That's the same thing I told you 4 weeks ago. Was the Holocaust worth having Israel for? That's a horrendous question to ask. It's a terrible question to ask. Who can ask such a question? You can't ask a question like that. First of all, there's no answer, but it's also a horrendous question because if you say that it's worth it, which is essentially what you're saying, how, how can you qualify that? How can you qualify that October 7th was worth the situation where Israel no longer has to worry about rockets coming down on it every year from Gaza? Every year it happened. It was not a one-time occurrence, folks. You remember every year when we went to Israel in 2023, in between our February trip and our June trip in May, there were rockets, and people were saying to me, "Are we going to be able to go to Israel in June?" And I said, "Yes, we'll be able to go to Israel in June because these rockets will be over in a week." I had no idea in June that we were going to have to deal with October 7th, you know, 5 months later, 4 months later. I had no idea, but I did know that those rockets would be come to an end. And I just in my mind figured, no, next May there'll be rockets again. And we have to hope we don't have a group there when we have to make an adjustment. And hopefully no one will get killed and hopefully the Iron Dome will work. But again, one of the reasons why we're taking people to Israel again in November is so you can see where the Iron Dome was. You can see where the borders of Lebanon are, where Israel has had to go into. We took people a few months ago to the kibbutz right on the border, and we'll do that. We'll be doing that again in November. We're going to take people from one end of the country to the other so you can see how Israel is creating a situation where people will be able to be safe and secure, not for 1 year, but for generations. And I do hope that it's going to happen. It may not be this year, but it's close. It's close enough where I could say maybe it will be by the end of the year. I don't know that Iran will still have the same regime by the end this year. I can't say for sure it'll be gone, but there will be a different situation for Israel. And what we have to take hope from is the fact that Israel can defend itself at a level that, again, to some extent, go listen to the on the Dan Senor podcast. They had a wonderful interview and discussion over the pagers. It wasn't on a Dan Senor's podcast. It was an article in the Jerusalem Post. I'll post the link, folks, on our page. An amazing story about the pager operation, and a book was just written about it by some of the people who they fictionalized some of it, but it's basically an account of one of the most amazing, one of the most uh, uh, espionage operations that you'll ever hear. I mean, it makes the stuff that goes on in Mission Impossible and James Bond seem like child's play.
Regarding the commercial that I mentioned very, very early on, if you Google
The
"stand
the
up the
the,
Jewish hate" space Tony, like the short for Anthony, you will find the link to that commercial. I think it's a 30-second
pager
commercial. It's worth watching.
and he talked. Yeah. I'll put it in right now. I'll put it into the chat. And again, for those to and see with your own in November. And again, even for those who've gone recently, I think you'll I think you'll I think you'll be interestingly um, inspired and surprised and moved, and some of it's tears. I'm not going to lie. Walking through the Nova site, I don't know how you don't cry, you have to have a heart of stone not to cry at Nova site. But by the way, the Blue Star Alliance right now, the website is says it's undergoing maintenance. So, all right, folks. I
I have one
appreciate.
question, Rabbi,
Yes,
before we
yes.
finish. Did anybody else have trouble? You were fading in and out during this.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I apologize.
Yes.
I heard it from other people. I heard it from other people that I couldn't hear them, but I didn't know it was on my end. I apologize
No,
because I
no,
am
that's
in
right. I
a
just wanted you to know.
I'm in a hotel in the Palm Desert in the Indio area tonight. I'm at a conference the next day, so I apologize. I just put in the video though. I put in the link on YouTube that the commercial that Alan was referring to. So
I've seen this one.
Thanks everybody for being here and
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
we'll
you.
see you soon.
Hey, everybody, see you. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Rabbi.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.